Welcome to the first part of this talk about politics in the UK. Now, you sometimes might come across words that you're not really familiar with when you're reading or watching something about UK parliaments or governments. What do Westminster and Whitehall refer to? What are backbenchers? And what does the Speaker do? These are just some of the questions I'm going to answer today, as well as looking at the system of government in the UK, what Parliament does, how MPs are elected, as well as a closer look at some of the rules and traditions in the House of Commons. But before we start, I'd like to ask you all a question. What do you think? Does the UK have a written constitution? Well, we don't have one single document where everything's written down. Unlike the US or France, the UK has never had a violent political revolution that led to a totally new system of government. So our democracy has evolved over a long period of time. Now, while we don't have one single document, we do have a whole range of sources, some of which are written, some of which are unwritten, that form the basis of our system. Perhaps the most famous of these, and certainly the oldest, is Magna Carta from 1215. It was a document that the barons forced the king of the time, King John, to accept and sign. And it was important because it established the idea that everybody, even the king, was subject to the law. The Bill of Rights from 1689 was also important because it set out the powers of Parliament as opposed to the powers of the monarchy, and it also gave extended powers to Parliament. Then we had the Reform Act of 1832, which began the process of making UK politics more democratic. And in fact, there are many other acts of Parliament that enshrine our laws that also form part of this unwritten constitution. And of course, we also have many conventions and traditions that have been handed down over time and have become so accepted that they now form part of how things are done in the UK. In fact, as Jack Straw, the Secretary of State for Justice, said in 2008, the Constitution of the United Kingdom exists in hearts and minds and habits as much as it does in law. Now, this all came to a head in August 2019 when the Prime Minister wanted to prorogue Parliament, and of course did prorogue Parliament. It was considered an unconstitutional move by many people. And the question arose, did the monarch have to agree? It was a question that was taken to the courts and then to the Supreme Court to be answered. And people said that if we didn't have a written constitution, it was about time we had a written constitution, because this was the kind of situation that we didn't want to have. But be that as it may, we don't have a written constitution. But what is our political system? Well, we are a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy. A constitutional monarchy because we have a monarch as our head of state, Queen Elizabeth II, and a parliamentary democracy because we have an elected parliament that makes and passes laws. Now, while the monarch does have powers, the monarch invites the leader of the party with the largest number of MPs to become the Prime Minister. The monarch has regular meetings with the Prime Minister and can advise, warn, and encourage the government as to what to do through the Prime Minister. But the decisions on government policies are made by the Prime Minister and by the Cabinet. You probably don't know, I didn't know, that the modern British Parliament is one of the oldest continuous representative assemblies in the world. It's over 700 years old, and it's taken many, many years for it to evolve and take the form it has today. As you can see on the picture, this is the Palace of Westminster. This is where Parliament meets, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And Westminster is actually used to refer to the UK Parliament. It also is obviously the part of London where the buildings are, and the Palace of Westminster is the actual building where they meet. So a question for you now. How many parts does the UK Parliament have? 1, 2 or 3? Parliament has 3 parts. The main work is carried out by the 2 chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. As you probably all know, the House of Commons is our elected chamber. It's where our members of Parliament, or MPs for short, who are voted in by the public, meet and discuss policies and make laws. It's the most powerful of the 2 houses. Here you can see a photograph of inside the House of Commons. You can see the green of the benches. The House of Commons is green. You can see documents on the table that are bound in green card as well. The second chamber is the House of Lords, And this is different to the House of Commons because it's not an elected chamber, it's an appointed chamber. So all of the people who sit in the House of Lords are not elected by the people, but are appointed by the monarch on the advice of the Prime Minister. The House of Lords' main job is to double check new laws to make sure they're fair and that they'll work. As you can see, the colour for the House of Lords is dark red. And the third element of our parliament is the monarchy. The monarch, the Queen has, in this case, has the final say on whether a bill becomes law. This is because the Queen is our head of state. She, of course, accepts the advice of her government, but nevertheless, the Queen has to sign bills to become law. She also has some other important ceremonial roles, one of which is, as you can see here, the state opening of Parliament. Every session of Parliament is opened by the monarch, and she comes into Parliament, she reads out a speech that's written by her government that sets out the legislation for the coming period. In this case, she's accompanied by the heir to the throne, Prince Charles, and here you can see her in the House of Lords wearing her ceremonial robes and reading out the Queen's speech, as it's officially known as. So what do the House of Commons and the House of Lords actually do? Well, they have different tasks that they have to carry out. They have to check and challenge the work of the government. This is very important. Perhaps most importantly of all, they make and change laws. They debate important issues of the day. And they have to check and approve government spending, so budget and taxes. Generally, decisions that have been made in one house have to be approved by the other, so we have a system of checks and balances in place, and they also check and challenge the work of the government. But let's have a quick look at how laws are made in the UK. What we start off with is a bill, and a bill is a draft law, a proposed law. Now, it can be introduced by the government, it can be introduced by an individual MP, or it can be introduced by the House of Lords. So we do have the option of laws being introduced in the House of Commons and then moving to the House of Lords, or we have the option of them being introduced into the House of Lords and then moving to the House of Commons. Whichever way it happens, there's a set procedure for the way the laws have to go through readings, and this is as follows. Let's imagine an individual MP introduces a draft law into the House of Commons, hence the green. The first thing that happens is a first reading. And this means that the short title of the bill is read out, and then the bill is ordered to be printed. It's then published as a House of Commons paper for the first time. It's a fairly short process. The second reading is very important because it's the first opportunity the MPs have to debate the general principles and themes of the bill. After this, it goes to a committee stage where a committee evaluates it, reads it in depth and discusses it in depth. Then they have a report on the findings of the committee, and then it goes into a third reading when it's hopefully passed. After it's been passed in the House of Commons, it gets sent up to the House of Lords, where it goes through the same set procedure again in the House of Lords. Now, what might happen in this case is there might be amendments made. The House of Lords might say, well, we'll accept it as long as the following changes are made. And once the amendments have been made, they're considered in both houses. Now, if a member of the House of Lords decides to introduce a bill, then the procedure is the other way round. So it starts off with the procedure in the House of Lords, then moves to the House of Commons. But once the amendments have been considered and approved, we still don't have an Act of Parliament. A bill only becomes an Act of Parliament once it's been given royal assent. So only after the Queen has signed her name does it mean that the bill becomes an act. You might wonder, does the Queen ever say no? Generally, the Queen or the monarch always acts on the advice of the government. In fact, the last time that a monarch declined to sign an Act of Parliament, sign a bill into becoming an Act of Parliament, was 300 years ago. So it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened in recent memory. So let's have a closer look at the House of Commons. As I said before, the House of Commons is where our MPs, our members of Parliament, sit. But how do they get elected? Well, the UK is divided into 650 constituencies or areas. and each constituency has one Member of Parliament. On polling day, the day of the election, the electorate goes to the polls and they vote for the Member of Parliament that they would like to see in their constituency. Once this has been done, the votes are counted, and the Member of Parliament for that constituency who has the most votes gets the job, is returned to Parliament, as we say. This system is called a first past the post system. So, unlike other systems which are proportional representation, where the number of seats is proportional to the number of votes the party gets, in the case of the UK, it's first past the post. Once the votes have been counted, the monarch invites the party with the majority to form a government, and the leader of the party becomes Prime Minister. However, if no party has a majority, we have what's called a hung parliament. So if 650 constituencies, that means for a majority you need 326 seats. What happens if a party doesn't win the necessary 326 seats? Well, the leader of the party with the most seats tries to form a government. And this can take two different forms. There can be a formal coalition with other parties in which the coalition partners share ministerial jobs and push through a shared agenda. Or there can be a more informal arrangement, which is known as a confidence and supply agreement. In this case, smaller parties agree to support main legislation, so things like the budget or the Queen's speech put forward by the largest party, but they don't formally take part in government. This last happened in 2017 when the Tory party, the Conservatives, had a majority but didn't have an overall majority, so they formed a confidence and supply agreement with the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland, and that smaller party agreed to give them the votes when they needed them and to pass legislation through. How often do we have general elections in the UK? They're held every 5 years on the first Thursday in May. And this has been the case since 2011 when we have had the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and that specified that they have to be held every 5 years. You probably know there are some exceptions. In 2019, we had a general election in December. And not after the 5 year period, but that was agreed by Parliament, and so that was accepted. That wasn't a problem. If we want to see how many seats each party has, we can go to the Parliament website and it'll give you an overview of the number of MPs for each party. And what becomes clear if we look at this overview here is that we have a two-party system. The Conservatives have 365 seats, the Labour Party has 202. So really these are the two parties that have the majority of the seats. We do have some parties that represent the interests of various countries in the UK. So the Scottish National Party represents the interests of Scotland. The Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin represent the interests of Northern Ireland. And Plaid Cymru, with 4 MPs, represents the interests of Welsh, the Welsh. Now, we need 326 MPs to reach a simple majority in the 650-seat House of Commons, but in reality, we actually only need a smaller number because the Speaker and the 3 deputies don't vote, and there's actually one party that doesn't attend Parliament. So the working majority needed is actually only 320. Now, which party doesn't attend Parliament and how can this be? It's Sinn Féin, one of the parties that represents Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin also represents within Ireland the Republic of Ireland, and they've always held a policy of abstentionism when it comes to the House of Commons. This is because it believes the interests of the Irish people can only be served by democratic institutions in Ireland and not at Westminster, so not in London. They also oppose taking an oath of allegiance to the Queen, which is something that every MP has to do in order to take their seat. So they say that by not taking their seats, they're fulfilling the wishes of the electorate in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. What can be really interesting is to take a look inside the House of Commons. As you can see here, this is an empty chamber, or fairly empty chamber. There are still 1 or 2 members of Parliament sitting there. Here you get to see that the benches are all green, but it's very interesting to go and have a look inside to see how Parliament actually works. And if you go to the website parliamentlive.tv, you can go and watch Parliament in session. Now, by convention, if we look straight ahead at the photograph, you can see that there's a chair at the very, very end, the far end, and that's where the Speaker sits. And by convention, the government and the party with the majority sit on the right-hand side of the Speaker, and the official opposition sit on the left-hand side of the Speaker. The smaller parties also sit on the left-hand side of the Speaker as well, the smaller and minority parties. The ministers sit on the front benches, so the people who are maybe in the cabinet or the shadow cabinet, and the back benches, so those MPs who don't have an official role within government, sit on the benches closest to the walls. It's interesting to watch a debate in Parliament simply because it's very different to what you might expect. It can be extremely noisy. There are people who express their opinion in a very robust manner. There's loud expressions of approval or disapproval, and sometimes there's a lot of very witty talk going on. What's also interesting to see is that the way that people address each other in the House of Commons. They don't address each other as you, so they wouldn't talk about Mr. Brown or Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. They always refer to each other as the Honourable Member for. Now that's how they refer to somebody who works on the opposition. So you would never say Mrs. Brown, who is a member of the opposition, but the Honourable Member for, and then you might say the name of the constituency. If you're referring to somebody who is in your own party, you might refer to my honourable friend. This is because in the House of Commons, you always address other members of the House through the chair, so through the Speaker. You do not directly address other members as you, but you use this very formal way of addressing them. Now, you'll also notice that people dress fairly formally. Yes, I suppose that's understandable. It's frowned upon to wear jeans, t-shirts, sandals and trainers. And if you do dress inappropriately, you might not be called upon by the Speaker to speak. It's also written down in the rule books that when listening to a debate, you shouldn't read a book or a newspaper. Obviously, that would be a sign of disrespect, or be writing things that are not related to the debate. And in addition, when you're talking to the House, if you've been asked to speak, you should turn and face the chair. So face the Speaker at the very end and never turn your back on the chair. That's considered to be very rude. So as you can see, we do have quite a lot of rules and customs and traditions in the House of Commons. And I'll now show you a few more that might seem even a little bit more antiquated for people who are not familiar with them. Well, the backbenchers, as I explained, are the members of Parliament who don't have an official government position. They sit on the nearest the walls in the chamber. But what you'll see in this picture is something quite interesting. At the very front of the picture, you'll see that there's a gold stick, I'm going to call it, on the table in the middle of the chamber. Now, it's not called a stick, obviously, it's called the mace. And the mace in Parliament is a symbol of royal authority. Remember, Parliament's made up of three parts: the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the monarch. And so the mace is the symbol of royal authority, and if it's not in the House of Commons, they may not meet or pass laws. It's about 1.5 meters in length. It's made of silver with gold on top, and it's put on the table of the House every morning. Every morning there's a procession from the Speaker's office in the House of Commons to the actual chamber, and the mace is carried at the front of this procession, and then it's put on the table to symbolise the royal authority. Voting is also done a little differently to what many people might expect. When a vote is held in the House of Commons, the Speaker asks members to call out whether they agree or not. So the Speaker will say, all those in favour, aye, and then meaning yes, and so all those in favour will shout out aye, and then it will say all those in favour no, and then they'll all shout out no if they're against it. And then the Speaker will judge whether it's a clear result or not. Now, obviously, in some cases, it's very clear as to whether everybody supports it or not. But in other cases, you don't want to leave this up to chance. So the Speaker will then call a division by announcing clear the lobbies. And when that happens, everybody, all the MPs file out of the chamber and they have to then walk through the I lobby or the no lobby, a lobby being a room, and their vote is written down by the clerks, who then come back into the chamber once they've counted them all, present their findings to the Speaker, who announces the results to the chamber. Another interesting idea that we have is, or tradition that we have, is holding an MP hostage during the Queen's speech. You remember that the Queen comes and opens Parliament, formally opens Parliament for each parliamentary session. And before the Queen sets foot in the Houses of Parliament, an MP is taken to Buckingham Palace. And this is in case something bad happens to her. It's a tradition that dates back many centuries, when the monarch and parliament didn't really get on so well, and the idea was that if anything bad happened to the monarch, the same thing would happen to the MP, so people would be less likely to do something bad to the monarch. And it's a tradition that's being continued right to the present day. Now, we don't just have traditions to do with old things. Conventions and traditions and customs do change with the times. And the same is true with mobile phones. Obviously, this is something that is a fairly new development over the past couple of decades. And it's now been enshrined in what happens with mobile phones. The members of Parliament may use electronic devices in place of paper notes in debates, and they may consult them when they're not speaking. But they're not supposed to use them to check their social media or whatever else they're doing, and it shouldn't look as if they're not listening to the debate. The devices have to obviously be in silent mode, and they're not supposed to take telephone calls in the chamber. They're also not supposed to use the devices to take photographs, to make films, or to make audio recordings in or around the chamber. Now, you might know that when Parliament was prorogued in 2019, there was actually an MP who did a film within the chamber to show the prorogation of Parliament as it was happening, and this was subsequently put on YouTube. So, who keeps control in Parliament, in the House of Commons? Well, it's the Speaker. The Speaker is a member of Parliament, and what's very important, however, whilst the Speaker is a member of Parliament, as soon as they're elected, they have to resign from their political party, and they're not allowed to continue to belong to that political party as long as they're Speaker. They deal with their constituents' problems like any normal MP does, but they're not allowed to represent a political party. The Speaker is chosen by the MPs. So once there's been a general election, the MPs will then choose their new Speaker if the previous Speaker has resigned. There will be the Speaker's role is to chair debates in the Commons, so they're in charge of keeping order during the debates and calling the MPs to speak. Now, this can be a difficult task depending on the type of debate, and as you can imagine, during the whole Brexit process, there was a lot of very heated discussions in the House of Parliament, which is why John Bercow, who was the Speaker at the time, became a familiar face, and often his calls of order went viral on YouTube because he had a very specific way of doing it. Perhaps one of the most important things about the Speaker, though, to do with the fact that they resign from their party when they become Speaker, is that they have to remain politically impartial at all times. So the Speaker is not allowed to campaign on any political issues. This is very important that the Speaker is impartial, because they have to be in charge. Well, there are also rules, customs, and traditions around the Speaker, and perhaps one of the one of the ones I'm most fond of, is dragging the Speaker of the House of Commons. Once the Speaker of the House of Commons has been elected, the Speaker just doesn't get up and then move to the chair where they sit down in the middle of the House of Commons, but they're physically dragged there by other MPs. Now, this tradition has its roots in the fact that the Speaker's function is and was to communicate things that went on in the House of Commons to the monarch. And in the past, if the monarch didn't like what the Speaker told them, the Speaker might actually get executed. So it was, as you can imagine, not a very popular job at times. And this is a tradition that's continued into the current day. Of course, there's no danger of the Speaker losing their heads nowadays, but nevertheless, it's a tradition you can see here. If you're interested, just go to this website and have a look. I already mentioned the Speaker's procession. Every day, the Speaker goes from his or her office in the House of Commons behind the Sergeant at Arms who carries the mace and puts it down in the House of Commons in the chamber on the table to open the chamber for the day. And this is a rather nice procession. There are police along the route who call out Speaker so that people who might be standing in the way move aside for the Speaker's procession. And in the central lobby of the Houses of Parliament, there might be members of the public standing around. The police inspector on duty shouts, "Hats off, strangers," to announce the arrival of the Speaker. Now, this photo that I've included here is rather special. It's not an everyday procession of the Speaker. This is actually at the state opening of Parliament, because the Speaker is wearing rather fancy robes. He's wearing ceremonial robes. This doesn't happen every day. This is really only for the opening of Parliament. And finally, you can see the Speaker's general procession here. This is with Sir Lindsay Hoyle, who is the current Speaker, and he's shown processing through the House of Commons. It's rather nice. The last tradition is catching the Speaker's eye, and this just shows how important the Speaker's role is. If you want to participate in a debate in the House of Commons, or you want to ask a question at question time, the MPs have to be called by the Speaker. And what the MP normally do is they rise or half rise in their seats in a bid to get the Speaker's attention, and this is what's known as catching the Speaker's eye. The government in the UK is officially known as Her Majesty's government because it's the government that Her Majesty has called into being and has been appointed by the electorate. The government is led by the Prime Minister, in this case the Right Honourable Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister oversees the operation of, obviously it's the leader of the government, but also oversees the operation of the civil service and government agencies, appoints members of the government, and is obviously the most principal, the main government figure in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister is also a member of the Cabinet. There are 22 different members of the Cabinet. The Cabinet is made up of senior members of government, and they meet every week during Parliament to discuss the most important issues for the government. Some of the names of the departments within the government are quite interesting. We have the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's in charge of the Treasury or the Finance Department. We have the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, who's in charge of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And we have the Secretary of State for the Home Department, who's responsible for the Home Office. There are obviously other members of the Cabinet too. Ministers are chosen by the Prime Minister from the members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and they're responsible for what goes on in their departments. Another 3 or 4 people you might not have heard of are the whips, who are led by the chief whip. Now, the whips are largely responsible for organising the work of the House of Commons. Sometimes they also help count votes if there's a division, so a vote in the House of Commons where the MPs process in and out. Then the whips act as tellers, so they count the votes in the decisions. But the whips, and led by the chief whip, are also responsible for making sure that the members of their party attend Parliament and vote in Parliament as the party leadership wants them to. So if there's a very important vote coming up, the chief whip and the whips will go round the different MPs and make sure they're going to attend, and make sure, more importantly, that they're going to vote as they're supposed to. The official opposition, also known as Her Majesty's official opposition, is led by the leader of the opposition, and he's or she is also head of the shadow cabinet. This is the shadow cabinet basically mirrors the cabinet in the government, and it's a way the opposition presents itself as an alternative government in waiting. And the role of the official opposition is, of course, to question and scrutinise what the government does, and make sure that they're there to check what's going on. So, number 10, Downing Street in Whitehall. Well, I suppose most of you know that the Prime Minister lives at number 10 Downing Street, but what does it mean if these words are used in the news? For instance, you might come across a newspaper headline such as Downing Street rejects the EU's opening offer. What does Downing Street refer to in this context? In this context, Downing Street refers to the British government. And it's Downing Street, meaning the place where the Prime Minister lives, and being the government that the Prime Minister is head of. If we see number 10, so for instance, number 10, the UK aims to restore independence from the EU by the end of the year. This is a way of referring to the Prime Minister or the people who represent him or her. So in this case, it might be that there's been an official announcement from number 10, and the spokesperson for the Prime Minister is giving an announcement. And finally, Whitehall. If we see something like Whitehall is in need of reform, Whitehall refers to the civil service and government agencies. So I hope that's been informative and interesting for you. I look forward to seeing you again for part 2, in which we'll be talking about the House of Lords, the role of the monarch, and the judiciary and the Supreme Court. So thanks for joining me, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.